Good evening. We're glad that you've tuned in to be with us tonight for our midweek Bible study. We're in the book of James, and let me encourage you to turn over to James, and we're going to read from chapter 1 in just a moment. But if you will, hit that share button, because that gives people opportunity to get in with us on our study. And our study, we're looking at faith. Right now, faith is under test, it's under trial. And sometimes we have trials in our life. I asked a guy the other day, do you ever have troubles? And he said, are you kidding? He said, I was born in troubles. And I think we all know that there are troubles that come our way from time to time. And there are two books in the New Testament that deals with trouble. And they're both based on trials that occurred because of persecution. One is the book of James that we're studying, and a companion volume to it. You know, if you get your English Bible and you open it up in the New Testament, you go from James. What's the very next book? 1 Peter. Well, 1 Peter is a book that is about troubles as well. And James is the earlier book because there was troubles and trials that were going on starting back in Acts chapter 8. The Bible says in verse 1 that great persecution arose on the church. And then down in verse 6 or 7, he talks about the fact that they that were scattered abroad went everywhere preaching and teaching the gospel. And that was the first wave of persecution upon the church that was trying their faith. A second wave occurred in 65. Well, back in 64, Peter writes his book. Most scholars agree that Peter wrote 1 Peter about a year before Nero began persecuting the Christians. And so we have two great books that deal with how to make it through trouble and trials in our lives, and it deals with faith. You know, James is such a practical book. Sometimes you get owner's manuals with various types of equipment and machinery. You know, you buy a microwave, bought one not too long ago, and had to get the owner's manual out, see how to work it. And this is true in a lot of things. Well, guess what? We have an owner's manual in the Bible. It's called the book of James. Because when trials and troubles come, James will tell you four things. Number one, it'll tell you how to feel. He'll tell you how to think. He'll tell you how to be. And then he'll tell you what to do. And these are kind of the things that we're looking at right now. We're in the section of how we feel. Last week, one of the fear was the one that we were looking at. You know, we get to feeling fearful, and we talked about that. Tonight, we're going to talk about troubles when troubles come. Now, James begins in James 1 and verse 1. If you've got your Bible, I encourage you to turn over to chapter 1. We're going to look at 4 verses, maybe 6 before it is over with, but basically we're studying how to overcome trouble. Do you ever feel troubled? James says in the very beginning to the 12 tribes that were scattered abroad. Why were they scattered? Well, I can tell you why. They were running for their lives. They were being persecuted. And he's talking to people who knows what trials and troubles are. And so tonight, James is describing a faith that we need, a faith that works when life doesn't. And he begins with these attitudes that we want to talk about. And whenever there's troubles and tough times in our lives, and James chapter 1, and I want to read verses 2 through 4 with you together. And then I want you to kind of notice that James is going to give us an action plan whenever trials and troubles come. He says in verse 2, "Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials." You ever have trouble in your life? About every day you probably do. "Knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing." Now, James says, when troubles come your way, when troubles come rolling in on you, I kind of like the way that the Message Bible says here. He says, when troubles crowd your life. You know, sometimes we get crowded. He says, here is the action plan. Number one, don't resent it as intruders, but rather welcome it as friends. And that's true, isn't it? He says trouble is going to come your way. It's going to crowd in your life. Don't feel like there's an intruder on you, but welcome it as your friend. And then he says, realize that troubles come for a purpose. They come to test your faith. And when troubles test your faith, he says, the next thing is it will produce a quality in your life that's called endurance. We need endurance in our lives. You know what the problem with so many people is today? They quit too soon. They quit too soon. And James says, let me give you something that will give you steadfastness. I think the King James Version uses that word steadfastness, and I like that. We need to be steadfast. He says, when troubles crowd into your life, here's the action plan. Don't resent them as intruders, but welcome them as friends, and realize that they come to test your faith, and in the testing of your faith, to produce in you the quality endurance. And then he says, let the process go on until that endurance is fully developed. You see, we need endurance, but we need developed endurance so that, see, here comes, you do this and this, so that something is going to happen. And you know what it is? So that you will become a person of mature character and mature in integrity and have no weak spots. And that's what he says the purpose of this is about. But it begins with realize. You ever have to realize something? Last week I was supposed to meet a person and they were running about 10 minutes late, and whenever they got there they said, I'm sorry I'm late, but I was going down the interstate and I passed the exit to get off, and just as I passed I realized, you see there's that word, I realized I was supposed to get off there. And the problem was he had to drive about 5 miles down the road and turn around and drive 5 miles back. That's 10 minutes right there. And he says that's what happens. You see, when we realize certain things, you will have a better handle on your problems, a better handle on your trials and your troubles that are maybe overflooding you. Your success of handling the stress and the strain of the troubles in your life is going to be determined by what you realize. Now, if you really want to handle the troubles that come about in your life, you've got to be determined by what, it's going to be determined by what you realize. You realize by two components, what you know and what you remember. What you know and what you remember. And the best perspective that we can have that will help us to have stability in our life is when the heat is on, we're going to have good perspective, and perspective feeds our faith, and faith gives confidence. And that's why tonight, the name of our lesson, and you may have one of our handouts that was in the bulletin. You can go online. Tyler put our bulletin online, and you can go over to one of the pages in the bulletin, and you can find it. I've got mine filled out, but tonight, that's what we're going to cover. We're going to cover the trouble with trials. And tonight we want to begin by thinking about, well, what are some truths about trials? Let me just tell you some truth about troubles. Number one, troubles are inevitable. They are inevitable. They're going to come. James says in James chapter 1 and verse 2, when you encounter trials. He didn't say if they may come, or they may come, or you may get through life and they may not come. No, he says when they come. And over in John 16 and verse 33, I spoke on this Sunday morning, Jesus talked about the fact that in this world, he said, you will have persecution, tribulation. And he says, but take cheer. Why? Because I have overcome the world. In 1 Peter 4 and verse 12, the Apostle Peter, a companion book to the book of James, talking about trials and tribulations, says, be not surprised at the fiery ordeal that you are experiencing. Nobody is going to be immune to trouble. Nobody is immune or insulated to trouble. Nobody is isolated or exempt from trouble. These scriptures tell us that troubles are inevitable. Troubles are they're kind of like in school, in high school and college. You have what you call your major courses that you've got to take. English, some math, some science, some history, those. And then you have elective courses. Well, guess what? Trouble is not an elective course. This is not something that you choose. And if you want to graduate from the school of life, then you're going to have to go through troubles. Why? Because troubles are inevitable. And then number two, troubles are variable. They're not all alike. You know from experience, they come in all sizes, all shapes, all forms, don't they? One of my favorite places to go is Baskin-Robbins. I love their ice cream. And one of the things I like about Baskin-Robbins, now, you know, vanilla and chocolate and strawberry, there's good ice cream everywhere. But one of the things that I really like about Baskin-Robbins is it's 31 flavors. 31 flavors. And I like to get the 3 scoops where I can get a vanilla and a chocolate and a cherry, or I can get lemon cream, or I can get banana supreme, or whatever it may be. And I get to taste different ones. And you see, that's the way trials are. Troubles, they vary. When you encounter troubles, notice that James says in James 1 verse 2, that do not be surprised, as Peter says, when troubles come, he says, and you encounter various troubles. That word various actually is a word that means multicolored. And it's used several times in the Bible, and it talks about many different shades or many different sides. He says, when you encounter the multi-shades, the multicolors, the multi-sides of trouble, trouble comes in all shapes, forms, and sizes. Did you know that the government tells us that there are 415 different varieties of weeds in North America? And I know some of you are going, yeah, I know it. I've got every one of them in my garden. But you realize that there are more than 415 variations of troubles. There's a lot of kinds of troubles. Troubles are multifaceted, just like a diamond. In the diamond industry, more expensive the diamonds, the more sides they have on it. And it's that same Greek word. It's multifaceted, we call it. And the Bible tells us that troubles are going to vary. They're going to vary in 3 ways. They'll vary, number one, in intensity. That is, how painful they are. Sometimes it's major trouble. Sometimes it's little trouble, isn't it? But not only do they vary in intensity, but they also vary in frequency. Sometimes trouble, how often do they come? How much pain do they have? And then third, they may vary in duration. It may be trouble for just a little while. How long will they last? And so troubles vary. They vary by how painful they are. They vary in how often they come. And they vary in how long they're going to last. That's one of the great things about trouble is if you can have the perspective that this is going to pass, you see, you can get through these things. And so as we see this evening, that trouble is inevitable. Trouble is variable. And then number 3, let me suggest to you that trouble is unpredictable. When does trouble come upon you? Well, generally, it's kind of like my grandson, one of my grandsons, when he was about 2 years old, we had a surprise birthday party for him. And all of his cousins and aunts and uncles and everybody gathered together, and he come walking in unbeknowing what was going on, and everybody jumped up and hollered, what? Surprise! Well, you know what happened? He broke out crying. We scared him. We had to stop from the surprise party. We surprised him, all right? And when does troubles come? That's whenever they surprise you, isn't it? Troubles, they don't warn you in advance. They just show up when you least expect it. And that's why James says in James 1 and verse 2 that there are various types of trials that come, and when all kinds of trouble comes and they crowd into your lives, they intrude into your life, don't they? Have you ever noticed that trouble comes when at what I would call the least opportune time? When do you have a flat tire? When you're running late. Yeah. Whatever, ladies, are you trying to scurry around and get ready and you're already late to go to church and you grab up the baby and the baby throws up on you? You say, well, if you were ready 20 minutes ago, that'd been no big deal. But you see, it happens that way. And what makes a problem is that they catch us off guard. when we least expect it, when we're unprepared for it, when we're just not ready for it. And you can't schedule your troubles. You can't say, okay, I'm going to schedule trouble at such and such a time next week. You can't do that. It doesn't work that way. As a matter of fact, when James says when you encounter troubles, when they crowd into your life, that word encounter means to befall you. It's the same Greek word that Jesus used in the book of Luke and other Gospels when he described the parable of the Good Samaritan. You remember the Good Samaritan was the fellow who helped this individual that had been the victim of thieves. And Jesus starts off by saying that this fellow was on the road to Jericho and he fell among thieves. Why? Because it suddenly happened. It wasn't scheduled. It wasn't something that he says, well, when I get around the curve and everything gets kind of isolated, they're going to jump out and get me, and I need to be prepared. No, he fell among thieves. And that's what he is saying here. James is saying when you fall into troubles, when you encounter them. And so troubles are unpredictable. They're variable. They're inevitable. And then number 4, they're purposeful. You know, there's a purpose for the troubles that we have. Believe it or not, there's a purpose behind every problem that we have. Over in James chapter 1, and we read it just a moment ago, and I just want to remind you again, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. It produces endurance. How does God use your troubles in life? You see, we all are going to have troubles. I realize there's some who preach a gospel that says, oh, if you'll just follow us and follow Jesus, that, life will be so grand and there won't be any problems. But that's not true. There's going to be problems. You're going to have trouble. You're going to have trials. You're going to have tribulation in your life. But God can use those because there's purpose behind each one of them. And what is the purpose? To produce in you patience and endurance. That's why we have them. And then let me ask that question again. How does God use troubles in our lives? Well, there are 3 purposes that God gives us for troubles. And if you've got your outline, you might want to fill this in. First off, let me suggest to you in verse 3 that when trials come your way, they're there for the purpose of testing my faith. They test my faith. Now, it kind of helps me to realize where I am. We test ourselves all the time. If you ever get on a kick in which I got off of it and I need to get back on this health kick of walking and lifting weights and getting stronger, well, how do you get stronger? Take a correspondence course in weightlifting? I don't think that'll work. You have to experience it yourself. And you see, faith is like a muscle. See, you can think about exercise, you can read about exercise, you can talk to people about exercise, you can even get an exercise counselor. But until you do it, your muscles are not going to grow and they're not going to develop. Whenever I was in high school, I got tired of being pushed around on the football field. And I began to work out. And I tell you, where I started, I thought I was pretty strong till I hit the weight bench and found out I wasn't strong at all. And through a lot of work, a lot of trials, I got stronger. And see, the same thing is true for our faith. If you want great faith, you've got to endure things that develops great faith. And the way that strength in your character grows is by having a faith that is tested, that is exercised, that is stretched, that is strengthened. That word tested, the testing of your faith, that's talking about metals. You see, James is using a word that is describing, you take gold or silver, some precious metal, and you heat it up. And whenever you heat it till it will turn to a liquid form, all of the impurities will rise to the top and they skim it off. And then it becomes pure gold and pure silver. But without the heat, you do not have the pure metal. And that's why the Apostle Peter talks about our faith being tried as precious gold by fire. that trial, those troubles come in our lives, and they refine us just as heat refines the gold and the silver. And right now, the heat may be on in your life. The heat may be on. You may be in a crisis. And one of the classic examples of somebody who tells us about his life with the heat on is a man by the name of Job. If you'll go over to the Old Testament and read about Job, you'll find that he was a man who grew from the trials that God placed in his life. And there was purpose for it. The first one was they test our faith. And that's important, that we've got to test our faith. What we think is bad can actually be preparing us for good. If you go to the book of Genesis and you read about the story of Joseph, you'll find that all the things that Joseph went through, God had purpose for him being placed down in that dry well. He had purpose in Joseph being sold into Egypt. He had purpose in Joseph being in Potiphar's house. He had purpose in Joseph rotting away all those years in jail, because he knew that the salvation of his family was going to depend upon him when the time was right. And that's why Joseph says to his brothers over in Genesis 15 and verse 20, that all those things that you meant evil for me, God meant them for good. You see, Joseph understood the purpose of troubles. And then number two, troubles will develop our endurance. You know, over in James chapter 1 and verse 3, he says that the testing of your faith produces endurance. Steadfastness is another word. Perseverance is another word. Staying power. The ability to handle pressure. Let me ask you a question. How do you learn to handle pressure? How do you learn? Well, there's only one way. You got to experience it. And you know, today there are things in my life that I experience daily or weekly or monthly, and it doesn't even faze me anymore. It used to tear me up real bad. Today it doesn't bother me at all. Why? Because of experience. I've experienced it. And most people, like I said earlier, you know, they give up too soon. But there's some things that you just can't learn from a book. There's some things that you can't learn from talking to somebody else. You've got to experience. You've got to experience it. I was talking to a friend of mine today, and he was talking about scuba diving. And I have a daughter and son-in-law that they did scuba diving years ago. They don't now, but they couldn't take a correspondence course in scuba diving. There's no book that could explain it well enough to make them experienced. They had to actually get in the water. They had to actually go under the water. And the same thing is true when it comes to endurance in our life. I can tell you all about it. I can give you scriptures. We can pray about it. But nothing will take the place of what trouble can do in your life. And when you have that trouble and you have the right perspective and you realize the right things, then you're going to learn to endure. Now, how do you learn to handle pressure? Only through experience. And one of the things that God wants to teach us when things don't go our way is endurance. And when somebody has said, somebody will say, man, I'm just going through hell in my life right now. Well, let me tell you something. I love what one person said. If you're going through hell, keep going. Keep going. Isn't that right? Keep going. Don't stop. And so troubles will produce endurance. But then number three, trouble will also mature our character. It will mature our character because he says in verse 4, James 1 verse 4, let endurance have its perfect work. Let the process go on, in other words, until you become mature in character and integrity, and that there's no weak spots in you. Would you like to be like that? I read a study, I heard about this study that I think it went on in Russia of studying about animals and their life expectancy and their longevity. And they found that the easier that people made it on animals, the less healthy they were and the shorter they lived. Because they're actually built to go through some troubles and go through some trials. And so are we. We must go through these troubles so that we will become complete, lacking nothing. Well, so how does God want us to respond to trouble? If you look on your handout, there are 4 things that God wants us to do here in James chapter 1. I call them the 4 R's of responding to trouble. Number 1, rejoice. Write that down. Rejoice knowing God can use it. You know, somebody has said God doesn't waste anything. He wastes failures. He wastes problems. No, he can use troubles. He can use failure. He can use all these things. God can and will use anything that you give him, even troubles. Troubles that are yours, or troubles that are other people's troubles that were meant to fall and to harm you. Like I said about Joseph. Look at all the troubles that he didn't cause these troubles. Actually, God guided him through these troubles and moved him from trouble to trouble. And look how it developed him. And James says in James chapter 1, my brethren, count it joy when you fall into various trials. Now, I'm not saying that you have troubles, well, act like you don't. I'm not saying pretend that there's no problem, or as somebody says, just fake it till you make it, or put on a plastic smile. I'm not saying being a masochist about that. But I'm saying that when we suffer troubles, we must have a perspective that says, okay, listen, there's something that God is trying to teach me. Let me give you an illustration of a person in the New Testament. The Apostle Paul, if you go to Acts 16, you'll find that Paul was at Philippi, and he's in jail in Philippi. He was falsely accused. He was beaten. Eventually, he was set free. And then he writes back to that Philippian church a few years later, and he says, rejoice in the Lord, and again I say rejoice. You say, well, Paul, are you saying rejoice whenever problems come your way? And he says, no, you don't understand. He said, I didn't say rejoice in jail. I said rejoice in the Lord. See, there's a big difference in rejoicing for the trouble. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about rejoicing during the trouble, because what we know is true. What we know is true. Now, you know, the Bible, and I love this. David said in the 34th Psalm in verse 1, he said, I will rejoice because when I fall into trouble, you know what he said? The Lord's going to save me. The Lord's going to take care of me. I don't have to worry about it. And then number 2, not only rejoice, but relax. Relax and ask God for wisdom. Right in the middle of these troubles, in verse 7, he says that he that lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all men liberally. All of a sudden, he starts talking about wisdom. Why? Well, have you ever asked God to give you the wisdom that you need to overcome a trouble, or to handle the trouble, or to make it through a trouble? We need wisdom. We need wisdom for a number of things. 2 things, basically. We need wisdom to learn from trouble. See, that's one of the great things about trouble. We can learn from it. And then number 2, not only learn from it, but know what to do when it comes our way. What do I do when this trouble comes? You see, the devil wants to defeat you in your troubles, but God wants to develop you in your troubles. And then number 3 is rely. Rely on God, believing he will help us. That's why he says in James chapter 1 and verse 8, he says that you need to ask God, how? Believing. Believing. You've got to believe. Why? Because you've got to rely that God is going to take care of all of your troubles. And like I said, James and 1 Peter kind of go together. If you move from the next page after James, it's going to be 1 Peter. And he says there are various trials. And then you know what he says a little later on in that book? He says there's all kinds. There are variable grace. You know what that's saying? For every kind and variety of trouble, there is every kind and variety of grace that it takes to take care of those things. Now, for many people, trouble is going to make them bitter. It's going to make people bitter. But what makes the difference? Well, James says it's your faith. It is your faith. And then finally, refuse. Refuse to quit. Remembering God's promises. Do you know how many promises are in the Bible? Some scholars say over 7,000 promises. Man, that's a lot of promises. But let me just read one of the promises over in James chapter 1 and verse 7. He says, that here is a particular promise for people who keep their faith and rejoice through trouble. He says, for that man ought not to expect that he will receive anything from the Lord, being a double-minded man, unstable in all of his ways. And then notice in verse 12, he says, now if you keep your faith and not be unstable and not be double-minded, not wishy-washy, he says, blessed. You know what that word blessed means? Happy. Happy is the man that prevents or perseveres under trial. For once he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Who are those that's going to receive the blessing, that's going to receive the promise? Those that love him. Hey, that sounds a lot like Romans 8, verse 28. For all things work together for the good of those who love the Lord. See, not everything works good. Especially, and there's a qualification for those that things are going to work out good for them. You know what it is? For those who love the Lord. See, you got to love the Lord. You got to love the Lord. And so don't waste your sorrows. Don't waste your sufferings. Don't waste your troubles. You may be in a trial. Do you have a trial or trouble that's going on right now? Well, there's two questions I want to ask you as we close out. Number one, will you turn to God for help? Will you turn to him? Sometimes we turn to things that just get us in more trouble. And number two, will you let God teach you something? And will you learn from it? Let God teach you. But not only teach you, learn, be teachable. Thank you for tuning in to us tonight. That's all the time that we have. And may God bless you. Thank you.